We first consider the origin of manufacture, then its simple elements, then the detailed laborer and his implements, and finally, the totality of the mechanism. We shall now lightly touch upon the relation between the division of labor in manufacture and the social division of labor, which forms the foundation of all production of commodity. Division of labor in a society and the corresponding tying down of individuals to a particular calling develops itself, just as does the division of labor in manufacture from opposite starting points. Within a family, and after further development within a tribe, there springs up naturally a division of labor, caused by differences of sex and age, a division that is consequently based on a purely physiological foundation, which division enlarges its materials by the expansion of the community, by the increase of population, and more especially, by the conflicts between different tribes and the subjugation of one tribe by another. On the other hand, as I have before remarked, the exchange of products springs up at the points where different families, tribes, communities come in contact, for in the beginning of civilization, it is not private individuals but families, tribes, and that meet on an independent footing. Different communities find different means of production and different means of subsistence in their natural environment. Hence, their modes of production and of living and their products are different. It is this spontaneously developed difference which, when different communities come in contact, calls forth the mutual exchange of products and the consequent gradual conversion of those products into commodity. Exchange does not create the differences between the spheres of production, but brings what are already different into relation, and thus converts them into more or less interdependent branches of the collective production of an enlarged society. In the latter case, the social division of labor arises from the exchange between spheres of production that are originally distinct and independent of one another. In the former, where the physiological division of labor is the starting point, the particular organs of a compact whole grow loose and break off, principally owing to the exchange of commodities with foreign communities, and then isolate themselves so far that the sole bond, still connecting the various kinds of work, is the exchange of the products as commodity. In the one case, it is the making dependent what was before independent. In the other case, the making independent what was before dependent. The foundation of every division of labor that is well developed and brought about by the exchange of commodities is the separation between town and country. It may be said that the whole economic history of society is summed up in the movement of this antithesis. We pass it over, however, for the present. Just as a certain number of simultaneously employed laborers are the material prerequisites for division of labor in manufacture, so are the number and density of the population, which here correspond to the agglomeration in one workshop, a necessary condition for the division of labor in society. Nevertheless, this density is more or less relative. A relatively thinly populated country, with well-developed means of communication, has a denser population than a more numerously populated country, with badly developed means of communication. And in this sense, the northern states of the American Union, for instance, are more thickly populated than India. Since the production and the circulation of commodities are the general prerequisites of the capitalist mode of production, division of labor in manufacture demands that division of labor in society at large should previously have attained a certain degree of development. Inversely, the former division reacts upon and develops and multiplies the latter. Simultaneously, with the differentiation of the instruments of labor, the industries that produce these instruments become more and more differentiated. If the manufacturing system seize upon an industry, which previously was carried on in connection with others, either as a chief or as a subordinate industry, and by one producer, these industries immediately separate their connection and become independent. If it seize upon a particular stage in the production of a commodity, the other stages of its production become converted into so many independent industries. It has already been stated that where the finished article consists merely of a number of parts fitted together, the detail operations may re-establish themselves as genuine and separate handicrafts. In order to carry out more perfectly the division of labor in manufacture, a single branch of production is, according to the varieties of its raw material, or the various forms that one and the same raw material may assume, split up into numerous, and to some extent, entirely new manufactures. Accordingly, in France alone, in the first half of the 8th century, over different kinds of silk stuffs were woven, and in Avignon it was law that every apprentice should devote himself to only one sort of fabrication, and should not learn the preparation of several kinds of stuff at once. The territorial division of labor, which confined special branches of production to special districts of a country, acquires fresh stimulus from the manufacturing system, which exploits every special advantage. The colonial system and the opening out of the markets of the world, both of which are included in the general conditions of existence of the manufacturing period, furnish rich material for developing the division of labor in society. It is not the place here to go on to show how division of labor seizes upon, not only the economic, but every other sphere of society, and everywhere lays the foundation of that all-engrossing system of specializing and sorting men, that development in a man of one single faculty at the expense of all other faculties, which caused A. Ferguson, the master of Adam Smith, to exclaim, "We make a nation of helots and have no free citizen." But in spite of the numerous analogies and links connecting them, division of labor in the interior of a society, and that in the interior of a workshop, differ not only in degree, but also in kind. The analogy appears most indisputable where there is an invisible bond uniting the various branches of trade. For instance, the cattle breeder produces hides, the tanner makes the hides into leather, and the shoemaker the leather into boots. Here the thing produced by each of them is but a step towards the final form, which is the product of all their labors combined. There are besides all the various industries that supply the cattle breeder, the tanner, and the shoemaker with the means of production. Now it is quite possible to imagine with Adam Smith that the difference between the above social division of labor and the division in manufacture is merely subjective, exists merely for the observer, who in a manufacture can see with one glance all the numerous operations being performed on one spot, while in the instance given above, the spreading out of the work over great areas and the great number of people employed in each branch of labor obscure the connection. But what is it that forms the bond between the independent labors of the cattle breeder, the tanner, and the shoemaker? It is the fact that their respective products are commodities. What, on the other hand, characterizes division of labor in manufactures? The fact that the detail laborer produces no commodity. It is only the common product of all the detail laborers that becomes a commodity. Division of labor in society is brought about by the purchase and sale of the products of different branches of industry, while the connection between the detail operations in a workshop is due to the sale of the labor power of several workmen to one capitalist, who applies it as combined labor power. The division of labor in the workshop implies concentration of the means of production in the hands of one capitalist. The division of labor in society implies their dispersion among many independent producers of commodity. While within the workshop, the iron law of proportionality subjects definite numbers of workmen to definite functions, in the society outside the workshop, chance and caprice have full play in distributing the producers and their means of production among the various branches of industry. Different spheres of production, it is true, constantly tend to an equilibrium, for, on the one hand, while each producer of a commodity is bound to produce a use value, to satisfy a particular social want, and while the extent of these wants differs quantitatively, still there exists an inner relation which settles their proportions into a regular system, and that system one of spontaneous growth, and on the other hand, the law of the value of commodities ultimately determines how much of its disposable working time society can expend on each particular class of commodity. But this constant tendency to equilibrium of the various spheres of production is exercised only in the shape of a reaction against the constant upsetting of this equilibrium. The priori system on which the division of labor within the workshop is regularly carried out becomes in the division of labor within the society and a posteriori nature-imposed necessity, controlling the lawless caprice of the producers and perceptible in the barometrical fluctuations of the market prices. Division of labor within the workshop implies the undisputed authority of the capitalist over men that are but parts of a mechanism that belongs to him. The division of labor within the society brings into contact independent commodity producers, who acknowledge no other authority but that of competition, of the coercion exerted by the pressure of their mutual interests, just as in the animal kingdom, the bellum omnium contra omnes more or less preserves the conditions of existence of every species. The same bourgeois mind which praises division of labor in the workshop, lifelong annexation of the laborer to partial operation, and his complete subjection to capital, as being an organization of labor that increases its productiveness, that same bourgeois mind denounces with equal vigor every conscious attempt to socially control and regulate the process of production, as an inroad upon such sacred things as the rights of property, freedom, and unrestricted play for the bent of the individual capitalist. It is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against a general organization of the labor of society than that it would turn all society into one immense factory. If in a society with capitalist production, anarchy in the social division of labor and despotism, in that of the workshop are mutual conditions the one of the other, we find, on the contrary, in those earlier forms of society in which the separation of trades has been spontaneously developed, then crystallized, and finally made permanent by law, on the one hand, a specimen of the organization of the labor of society, in accordance with an approved and authoritative plan, and on the other, the entire exclusion of division of labor in the workshop, or at all events, a mere dwarf-like or sporadic and accidental development of the same. Those small and extremely ancient Indian communities, some of which have continued down to this day, are based on possession in common of the land, on the blending of agriculture and handicrafts, and on an unalterable division of labor which serves, whenever a new community is started, as a plan and scheme ready cut and dry. Occupying areas of from up to several thousand acres, each forms a compact whole producing all it requires. The chief part of the products is destined for direct use by the community itself, and does not take the form of a commodity. Hence, production here is independent of that division of labor brought about, in Indian society as a whole, by means of the exchange of commodity. It is the surplus alone that becomes a commodity, and a portion of even that, not until it has reached the hands of the state, into whose hands from time immemorial a certain quantity of these products has found its way in the shape of rent in kind. The constitution of these communities varies in different parts of India. In those of the simplest form, the land is tilled in common, and the produce divided among the members. At the same time, spinning and weaving are carried on in each family as subsidiary industry. Side by side with the masses thus occupied with one and the same work, we find the chief inhabitant, who is judge, police, and tax-gatherer in one, the bookkeeper, who keeps the accounts of the tillage and registers everything relating thereto, another official who prosecutes criminals, protects strangers traveling through and escorts them to the next village, the boundary man who guards the boundaries against neighboring communities, the water overseer, distributes the water from the common tanks for irrigation, the Brahmin who conducts the religious services, the schoolmaster, who on the sand teaches the children reading and writing, the calendar Brahmin or astrologer, who makes known the lucky or unlucky days for seed time and harvest, and for every other kind of agricultural work, a smith and a carpenter, who make and repair all the agricultural implements, the potter, who makes all the pottery of the village, the barber, the washerman, who washes clothes, the silversmith, here and there the poet, who in some communities replaces the silversmith, in others the schoolmaster. This dozen of individuals is maintained at the expense of the whole community. If the population increases, a new community is founded, on the pattern of the old one on unoccupied land. The whole mechanism discloses a systematic division of labor, but a division like that in manufactures is impossible, since the smith and the carpenter find an unchanging market, and at the most there occur, according to the sizes of the villages, 2 or 3 of each instead of one. The law that regulates the division of labor in the community acts with the irresistible authority of a law of nature, at the same time that each individual artificer, the smith, the carpenter, and so on, conducts in his workshop all the operations of his handicraft in the traditional way, but independently, and without recognizing any authority over him. Simplicity of the organization for production in these self-sufficing communities that constantly reproduce themselves in the same form, and when accidentally destroyed, spring up again on the spot, and with the same name this simplicity supplies the key, the secret of the unchangeableness of Asiatic societies, an unchangeableness in such striking contrast with the constant dissolution and refounding of Asiatic states, and the never-ceasing changes of dynasty. The structure of the economic elements of society remains untouched by the storm clouds of the political sky. The rules of the guilds, as I have said before, by limiting most strictly the number of apprentices and journeymen that a single master could employ, prevented him from becoming a capitalist. Moreover, he could not employ his journeymen in many other handicrafts than the one in which he was a master. The guilds zealously repelled every encroachment by the capital of merchants, the only form of free capital with which they came in contact. A merchant could buy every kind of commodity, but labor as a commodity he could not buy. He existed only on sufferance, as a dealer in the products of the handicraft. If circumstances called for a further division of labor, the existing guilds split themselves up into varieties, or founded new guilds by the side of the old ones, all this, however, without concentrating various handicrafts in a single workshop. Hence the guild organization, however much it may have contributed by separating, isolating, and perfecting the handicrafts, to create the material conditions for the existence of manufacture excluded division of labor in the workshop. On the whole, the laborer and his means of production remained closely united, like the snail with its shell, and thus there was wanting the principal basis of manufacture, the separation of the laborer from his means of production, and the conversion of these means into capital. While division of labor in society at large, whether such division be brought about or not by exchange of commodities, is common to economic formations of society the most diverse, division of labor in the workshop, as practiced by manufacture, is a special creation of the capitalist mode of production alone. An increased number of laborers under the control of one capitalist is the natural starting point, as well of cooperation generally, as of manufacture in particular. But the division of labor in manufacture makes this increase in the number of workmen a technical necessity. The minimum number that any given capitalist is bound to employ is here prescribed by the previously established division of labor. On the other hand, the advantages of further division are obtainable only by adding to the number of workmen, and this can be done only by adding multiples of the various detail groups. But an increase in the variable component of the capital employed necessitates an increase in its constant component, too, in the workshops, implements, and, in particular in the raw material, the call for which grows quicker than the number of workmen. The quantity of it consumed in a given time, by a given amount of labor, increases in the same ratio as does the productive power of that labor in consequence of its division. Hence, it is a law based on the very nature of manufacture, that the minimum amount of capital, which is bound to be in the hands of each capitalist, must keep increasing. In other words, that the transformation into capital of the social means of production and subsistence must keep extending. In manufacture, as well as in simple cooperation, the collective working organism is a form of existence of capital. The mechanism that is made up of numerous individual detail laborers belongs to the capitalist. Hence, the productive power resulting from a combination of labors appears to be the productive power of capital. Manufacture proper not only subjects the previously independent workmen to the discipline and command of capital, but in addition, creates a hierarchic gradation of the workmen themselves. While simple cooperation leaves the mode of working by the individual for the most part unchanged, manufacture thoroughly revolutionizes it and seizes labor power by its very roots. It converts the laborer into a crippled monstrosity by forcing his detailed dexterity at the expense of a world of productive capabilities and instincts, just as in the states of La Plata they butcher a whole beast for the sake of his hide or his tallow. Not only is the detail work distributed to the different individuals, but the individual himself is made the automatic motor of a fractional operation, and the absurd fable of Menenius Agrippa, which makes man a mere fragment of his own body, becomes realized. If at first the workman sells his labor power to capital, because the material means of producing a commodity fail him, now his very labor power refuses its services unless it has been sold to capital. Its functions can be exercised only in an environment that exists in the workshop of the capitalist after the sale. By nature unfitted to make anything independently, the manufacturing laborer develops productive activity as a mere appendage of the capitalist's workshop. As the chosen people bore in their features the sign manual of Jehovah, so division of labor brands the manufacturing workman as the property of capital. The knowledge, the judgment, and the will, which, though in ever so small a degree, are practiced by the independent peasant or handicraftsman, in the same way as the savage makes the whole art of war consist in the exercise of his personal cunning, these faculties are now required only for the workshop as a whole. Intelligence in production expands in one direction, because it vanishes in many others. What is lost by the detail laborers is concentrated in the capital that employs them. It is a result of the division of labor in manufactures that the laborer is brought face to face with the intellectual potencies of the material process of production as the property of another and as a ruling power. This separation begins in simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents to the single workman the oneness and the will of the associated labor. It is developed in manufacture, which cuts down the laborer into a detail laborer. It is completed in modern industry, which makes science a productive force distinct from labor and presses it into the service of capital. In manufacture, in order to make the collective laborer, and through him capital, rich in social productive power, each laborer must be made poor in individual productive powers. Ignorance is the mother of industry as well as of superstition. Reflection and fancy are subject to error, but a habit of moving the hand or the foot is independent of either. Manufactures, accordingly, prosper most where the mind is least consulted, and where the workshop may be considered as an engine, the parts of which are men. As a matter of fact, some few manufacturers in the middle of the 8th century preferred, for certain operations that were trade secrets, to employ half-idiotic persons. The understandings of the greater part of men, says Adam Smith, are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. After describing the stupidity of the detail laborer, he goes on. The uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. It corrupts even the activity of his body, and renders him incapable of exerting his strength with vigor and perseverance in any other employments than that to which he has been bred. His dexterity at his own particular trade seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtue. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall. For preventing the complete deterioration of the great mass of the people by division of labor, A. Smith recommends education of the people by the state, but prudently, and in homeopathic doses. G. Garnier, his French translator and commentator, who, under the First French Empire, quite naturally developed into a senator, quite as naturally opposes him on this point. Education of the masses, he urges, violates the first law of the division of labor, and with it, our whole social system would be proscribed. Like all other divisions of labor, he says, that between hand labor and head labor is more pronounced and decided in proportion as society becomes richer. This division of labor, like every other, is an effect of past and a cause of future progress. Ought the government then to work in opposition to this division of labor and to hinder its natural course? Ought it to expend a part of the public money in the attempt to confound and blend together two classes of labor, which are striving after division and separation? Some crippling of body and mind is inseparable even from division of labor in society as a whole. Since, however, manufacture carries this social separation of branches of labor much further, and also, by its peculiar division, attacks the individual at the very roots of his life, it is the first to afford the materials for, and to give a start to, industrial pathology. To subdivide a man is to execute him, if he deserves the sentence, to assassinate him if he does not. The subdivision of labor is the assassination of a people. Cooperation based on division of labor, in other words manufacture, commences as a spontaneous formation. As soon as it attains some consistence and extension, it becomes the recognized methodical and systematic form of capitalist production. History shows how the division of labor peculiar to manufacture, strictly so called, acquires the best adapted form at first by experience, as it were behind the backs of the actors, and then, like the guild handicrafts, strives to hold fast that form when once found, and here and there succeeds in keeping it for centuries. Any alteration in this form, except in trivial matters, is solely owing to a revolution in the instruments of labor. Modern manufacture, wherever it arises, I do not here allude to modern industry based on machinery, either finds the disjecta membra poeti ready to hand, and only waiting to be collected together, as is the case in the manufacture of clothes in large towns, or it can easily apply the principle of division, simply by exclusively assigning the various operations of a handicraft to particular men. In such cases, a week's experience is enough to determine the proportion between the numbers of the hands necessary for the various functions. A decomposition of handicrafts, by specialization of the instruments of labor, by the formation of detail laborers, and by grouping and combining the latter into a single mechanism, division of labor in manufacture creates a qualitative gradation and a quantitative proportion in the social process of production. It consequently creates a definite organization of the labor of society, and thereby develops at the same time new productive forces in the society. In its specific capitalist form, and under the given conditions, it could take no other form than a capitalistic one. Manufacture is but a particular method of begetting relative surplus value, or of augmenting at the expense of the laborer the self-expansion of capital, usually called social wealth, wealth of nations, and it increases the social productive power of labor, not only for the benefit of the capitalist instead of for that of the laborer, but it does this by crippling the individual laborers. It creates new conditions for the lordship of capital over labor. If therefore, on the one hand, it presents itself historically as a progress and as a necessary phase in the economic development of society, On the other hand, it is a refined and civilized method of exploitation. Political economy, which as an independent science, first sprang into being during the period of manufacture, views the social division of labor only from the standpoint of manufacture, and sees in it only the means of producing more commodities with a given quantity of labor, and consequently, of cheapening commodities and hurrying on the accumulation of capital. In most striking contrast with this accentuation of quantity and exchange value is the attitude of the writers of classical antiquity, who hold exclusively by quality and use value. In consequence of the separation of the social branches of production, commodities are better made. The various bents and talents of men select a suitable field, and without some restraint, no important results can be obtained anywhere. Hence, both product and producer are improved by division of labor. If the growth of the quantity produced is occasionally mentioned, this is only done with reference to the greater abundance of use value. There is not a word alluding to exchange value or to the cheapening of commodity. This aspect, from the standpoint of use value alone, is taken as well by Plato, who treats division of labor as the foundation on which the division of society into classes is based, as by Xenophon, who with characteristic bourgeois instinct approaches more nearly to division of labor within the workshop. Plato's Republic, in so far as division of labor is treated in it, as the formative principle of the state, is merely the Athenian idealization of the Egyptian system of castes, Egypt having served as the model of an industrial country to many of his contemporaries also, amongst others to Isocrates, and it continued to have this importance to the Greeks of the Roman Empire. During the manufacturing period proper, the period during which manufacture is the predominant form taken by capitalist production, many obstacles are opposed to the full development of the peculiar tendencies of manufacture. Although manufacture creates, as we have already seen, a simple separation of the laborers into skilled and unskilled, simultaneously with their hierarchic arrangement in classes, yet the number of the unskilled laborers, owing to the preponderating influence of the skilled, remains very limited. Although it adapts the detail operations to the various degrees of maturity, strength, and development of the living instruments of labor, thus conducing to exploitation of women and children, yet this tendency as a whole is wreaked on the habits and the resistance of the male laborer. Although the splitting up of handicrafts lowers the cost of forming the workman, and thereby lowers his value, yet for the more difficult detail work, a longer apprenticeship is necessary, and, even where it would be superfluous, is jealously insisted upon by the workman. In England, for instance, we find the laws of apprenticeship, with their 7 years' probation, in full force down to the end of the manufacturing period, and they are not thrown on one side till the advent of modern industry. Since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, and since the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no framework, apart from the laborers themselves, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the insubordination of the workman. By the infirmity of human nature, says friend Ure, it happens that the more skillful the workman, the more self-willed and intractable he is apt to become, and of course the less fit a component of a mechanical system in which he may do great damage to the whole. At the same time, manufacture was unable either to seize upon the production of society to its full extent, or to revolutionize that production to its very core. It towered up as an economic work of art, on the broad foundation of the town handicrafts and of the rural domestic industry. At a given stage in its development, the narrow technical basis on which manufacture rested came into conflict with requirements of production that were created by manufacture itself. One of its most finished creations was the workshop for the production of the instruments of labor themselves, including especially the complicated mechanical apparatus then already employed. A machine factory, says Ure, displayed the division of labor in manifold gradations: the file, the drill, the lathe, having each its different workmen in the order of skill. This workshop, the product of the division of labor in manufacture, produced in its turn machine. It is they that sweep away the handicraftsman's work as the regulating principle of social production. Thus, on the one hand, the technical reason for the lifelong annexation of the workman to a detail function is removed. On the other hand, the fetters that this same principle laid on the dominion of capital fall away.